The morning sun draped Pinegrove Estates in a soft, golden haze, washing over rows of pristine houses that looked almost identical, perfect lawns, symmetrical mailboxes, and hedges trimmed with surgical precision. To outsiders, it was a picture of suburban peace, a utopia of order and community. But to those who lived here, perfection came with a price, and her name was Karen Wilcox. She wasn't just the HOA president, she was its architect, enforcer, and self-declared queen. For 10 years, Karen ruled Pinegrove like her personal kingdom, wielding the HOA handbook like a royal decree. Her silver SUV patrolled the neighborhood every morning, her clipboard always in hand, her lips pursed in that signature expression of disapproval that could make grown men shrink. Every resident knew the sound of her tires on the road, a warning that inspections were underway. Karen had started small. A decade ago, she'd volunteered just to help keep the neighborhood nice. But power was addictive, and before long, her help became control. She restructured the HOA board, replaced anyone who disagreed with her, and amended rules to grant herself near-total authority. Now, everything from mailbox paint to porch decorations had to pass her approval. One resident received a warning for hanging Christmas lights 2 days early. Another was fined for parking a visitor's car in the driveway overnight. Karen justified it all as maintaining standards. She told herself she was protecting property values, but deep down, she craved obedience. Her word was law, and in Pinegrove, no one dared to defy her. It wasn't just her authority that made Karen dangerous, it was her smile. To the untrained eye, she seemed friendly, polite voice, immaculate wardrobe, pearls gleaming at her neck. But beneath the politeness was calculation. At HOA meetings, she'd wield charm like a weapon. "Now, we all just want what's best for Pinegrove," she'd say sweetly before announcing new restrictions that stripped away another ounce of freedom. Her board members, mostly retirees and stay-at-home spouses who depended on her approval, nodded along like puppets. And anyone who spoke against her quickly found themselves buried under a mountain of anonymous complaints and unexpected fines. Karen didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her power came from silence, the kind that spread fear with a smile. On a quiet Thursday morning, a new resident arrived, Evelyn Brooks. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled neatly into a bun and a calm, patient air about her. She'd recently retired after a long career in law and was looking forward to peace and gardening. She bought the old Thompson house at the end of Maple Lane, a cozy, ivy-covered home that had been neglected since the Thompsons moved out. The neighbors whispered warnings. "Watch out for Karen," one man said in a low voice as Evelyn unpacked boxes. "She'll find something wrong before you've even settled in." Evelyn only smiled politely, brushing it off as small-town gossip. But she noticed the way people looked around before mentioning Karen's name, like they feared being overheard. Evelyn's first encounter with Karen came sooner than expected. Just 3 days after moving in, she was kneeling in her garden, arranging terracotta pots of lavender and daisies, when the silver SUV rolled up beside her curb. The tinted window lowered, revealing Karen's impeccably curled hair and that ever-present clipboard. "Good morning," Karen said in a tone that sounded friendly but felt intrusive. "Welcome to Pinegrove. I see you're doing a little yard work." Her eyes flicked to the flower pots. Just a small note, outdoor decor must align with the HOA's approved color palette. "Those pots look rustic." Evelyn straightened up, wiping soil from her gloves. "They're antique," she said with a gentle smile. "I find the weathered look charming." Karen's smile tightened. "I'll just leave a reminder on your porch about the guidelines," she said, and drove off. By the afternoon, Evelyn found her first official HOA violation notice tucked neatly into her mailbox. The reason, unapproved front yard items not compliant with HOA visual standards. She chuckled softly, not in frustration, but amusement. After 30 years of handling property disputes and legal notices, this one read like amateur hour. She made tea, sat by her kitchen window, and watched as Karen's SUV continued its patrol down the street. She noticed how neighbors froze when Karen passed, how they rushed to move trash cans or fix crooked signs. Fear had turned the entire community into silent followers. That night, as Evelyn sipped her tea and reread the violation letter under her kitchen light, a quiet determination formed behind her calm eyes. In her career, Evelyn had seen every kind of power, political, financial, legal, and she knew the kind that lasted was never built on fear. 10 years, she murmured to herself, folding the letter neatly. That's a long time for someone like her to go unchecked. She didn't act right away. She didn't confront Karen or complain to the board. Instead, she began to observe, taking walks around the neighborhood, noting the patterns, the way people avoided eye contact when Karen's name came up. Every dictatorship had its cracks, she thought. And Karen Wilcox, Queen of Pinegrove, had just handed her the first one. Evelyn smiled softly as she turned off the kitchen light. Outside, the perfectly trimmed lawns of Pinegrove glowed beneath the street lamps, a kingdom built on control, unaware that its ruler had just made a fatal mistake. The next HOA meeting was held in Pinegrove's community hall, a space that looked more like a courtroom than a gathering place. The walls were lined with framed photos of past board members, all smiling stiffly in front of the neighborhood's signature fountain. At the center of the room stood a long oak table where Karen Wilcox presided like a judge on her bench. Her gavel gleamed under the fluorescent lights, her clipboard stacked high with folders, each one marked with the name of a resident. Folding chairs filled with uneasy homeowners stretched to the back of the hall, the air thick with the scent of coffee and anxiety. When Evelyn Brooks walked in, conversation died down almost instantly. People turned to look at her, not with curiosity, but with pity. She was new, and no one challenged Karen and came out unscathed. Evelyn moved with quiet grace, her white linen blouse crisp, her silver hair tied back neatly. She carried only a single envelope, the violation notice she'd received, and took a seat near the front. Karen noticed immediately. Her eyes flicked up from her clipboard, and a small, condescending smile appeared. "Ah," she said loudly, tapping her gavel, "our new neighbor on Maple Lane. Mrs. Brooks, was it? I understand you've come to discuss your compliance issue." Evelyn returned a polite nod. "I just wanted to clarify a few things," she said, her tone soft but steady. "I wasn't aware flower pots required prior approval." A few neighbors exchanged nervous glances. Everyone knew how this scene usually went. Karen straightened her pearl necklace and leaned forward, voice dripping with authority. "Our bylaws are clear, Mrs. Brooks. Page 12, Section C, all visible decorative items must be approved by the board. Perhaps you didn't read the welcome packet thoroughly." A few polite chuckles rippled through the board members, Karen's loyal inner circle. Evelyn didn't flinch. "I did read it," she replied evenly, "and it references an approved design list. I requested a copy from the HOA office but was told it wasn't available. Is that correct?" Karen's smile faltered for half a second. "That list is internal," she said quickly. "We keep it confidential to prevent misinterpretation." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "So, residents are expected to comply with rules they're not allowed to see?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time that night, the room fell completely silent. Karen's gavel tapped sharply. "Mrs. Brooks," she said, her tone tightening, "this is not a courtroom. If you wish to appeal, please complete the official request form. I'll review it personally." There it was, the dismissal. The same tactic Karen had used for years to silence dissent. Evelyn gave a small smile and nodded. "Of course," she said softly. But as she left the hall, she noticed something. The faces around her, once fearful and obedient, looked different tonight. A spark of curiosity, maybe even hope, flickered in a few of them. The next day, as the morning sun poured through her kitchen window, Evelyn laid out the HOA's governing documents on her table. The rules Karen quoted were full of vague language and missing references. Several pages even carried her signature in places it shouldn't have been. Evelyn recognized the pattern immediately. Amendments added without votes, decisions made without record. She could practically smell the legal vulnerability in every line. "You've been busy, haven't you, Mrs. Wilcox?" she murmured, sliding on her reading glasses. Hours turned into days as Evelyn worked quietly, combing through the bylaws with the patience of a former attorney who had once argued before state property boards. She found dozens of inconsistencies, financial entries that didn't match, fines issued without legal authority, even small reimbursements that looked suspiciously personal. But she didn't act impulsively. She knew Karen's kind, proud, territorial, convinced she was untouchable. A frontal confrontation would only feed her ego. Evelyn wanted precision, not chaos. So, she began drafting something Karen couldn't dismiss with a gavel, a formal legal notice. It wasn't a complaint. It was a statement, calm, factual, devastatingly clear. A week later, Karen received it. The letter arrived by certified mail, addressed neatly to Karen Wilcox, President, Pinegrove Estates HOA. Inside, written on crisp stationery, was Evelyn's formal response to the violation notice, but it read nothing like an appeal. Instead, it cited state property code violations, HOA transparency requirements, and IRS audit risks associated with unreported community funds. Evelyn didn't accuse, she documented. She referenced legal precedents, included photocopies of misfiled amendments, and requested, with perfect politeness, that Karen provide financial transparency records within 10 business days. The final line read simply, "As a resident, I look forward to your cooperation in restoring lawful governance to our community." When Karen read it, her hands trembled slightly. The language was too precise, too professional. She reread the signature, Evelyn M. Brooks, retired attorney at law. For the first time in 10 years, Karen felt something unfamiliar, fear. She looked out her window toward Maple Lane, where Evelyn's terracotta pots sat gleaming in the afternoon sun. 4 years, she'd crushed every challenge with intimidation and charm. But this time was different. The woman she'd tried to fine wasn't another timid homeowner. She was someone who knew exactly how to dismantle her power. One clause, one document, one letter at a time. The letter spread across Karen Wilcox's kitchen table like a quiet storm. It wasn't dramatic or emotional, just clean, deliberate, and devastatingly professional. The kind of letter that didn't shout, but made its message clear through precision. The bold header, formal request for compliance and transparency, seemed to stare back at her. Karen's fingers hovered over the paper as she reread the words, trying to convince herself it was nothing more than a nuisance. But each sentence chipped away at her confidence. Evelyn Brooks had cited 3 specific state codes, laws Karen had never even heard of, and each one undermined the very foundation of how she'd run Pinegrove's HOA for years. At the bottom, Evelyn's signature rested neatly, beside her credentials, retired property law attorney. The words burned. Karen had built her reign on intimidation, not legality. Now, for the first time, someone was calling her bluff. The next morning, she stormed into the HOA office, a tidy, glass-fronted room inside the community center that she'd practically turned into her personal throne room. Her assistant, Brenda, looked up nervously from her desk as Karen slammed the folder down. "Who approved this woman's residency?" Karen snapped, pacing behind her chair. Brenda blinked. "Mrs. Brooks?" "The real estate office did, same as everyone else." Karen's voice rose. "You don't understand. She's not just a resident. She's a lawyer. She's fishing for something." Brenda hesitated before saying softly, "She seems nice." Karen's glare froze her mid-sentence. "Nice people don't send legal letters," she hissed. "She wants to dismantle everything we've built here." She didn't say it out loud, but the thought pressed against her ribs. What she had built wasn't exactly by the book. Karen pulled out her binder of HOA records, flipping through the pages. Her eyes darted over the signatures, some genuine, others copied. There were small adjustments she'd made over the years, revising fine structures, reassigning maintenance funds, waiving her own dues for administrative purposes. It all looked harmless on paper, until someone who knew the law looked too closely. She sat down, her hand tightening around her pen. "We'll respond," she said finally. "Formally. I'll remind her who's in charge here." But her words lacked conviction. Deep down, Karen understood that Evelyn's letter wasn't just a complaint, it was a warning shot. The kind that came before something much larger. That evening, Karen hosted an emergency board meeting in her living room. The usual faces filled the chairs: Harold, the timid treasurer, Janice, her loyal vice president, and Frank, the maintenance supervisor who rarely spoke unless spoken to. Karen stood at the head of the table, waving Evelyn's letter like evidence in a trial. "This woman is trying to destroy us," she declared. "She's making baseless legal threats and demanding access to financial records that are none of her business." Harold fidgeted, avoiding her eyes. "Well, technically, the HOA's finances are public to members," he murmured. Karen's glare snapped to him. "Not without board approval," she shot back. "And I am the board." There was a pause, a long, uncomfortable one, before Janice cleared her throat. "Karen, maybe we should just show her the records. If there's nothing to hide, it'll shut her up." The room fell silent. Karen's jaw tightened. Nothing to hide. The words echoed in her head. She remembered the reimbursement forms, small purchases labeled as community expenses that weren't exactly community-related. Office furniture for her home, holiday decorations that never made it past her porch. It wasn't fraud, she told herself, just perks of hard work. But now, under scrutiny, every receipt felt like a confession. "Absolutely not," Karen said finally. "If we give her those records, she'll twist them. That's what lawyers do." The board members exchanged wary glances. 4 years, they'd followed her unquestioningly, comforted by her confidence. But tonight, her voice trembled ever so slightly, and that small crack in her armor didn't go unnoticed. The following days were a blur of anxiety. Karen tried to continue her routine, the morning inspections, the polite hellos, the thinly veiled threats, but something had shifted. When she passed neighbors on her walks, they didn't wave back as quickly. Some turned away altogether. She could feel it, whispers spreading, rumors brewing. Evelyn didn't need to confront her in public. The letter had already done the work. Every homeowner knew it existed, though no one dared to say it outright. Late one night, Karen sat alone in her office, the sound of the ticking clock louder than usual. Her once proud HOA binders lay open before her, their glossy covers now symbols of fragility. She thought about sending her own letter, something threatening, full of legal jargon copied from the internet, but stopped herself. For the first time, she didn't know what to say. Then came the second envelope. It arrived quietly, just as the first had, hand-delivered, neatly folded, bearing Evelyn's calm signature. This time, the contents weren't a warning. They were evidence. Attached were public records, a copy of Pinegrove's HOA registration, Karen's signature on unauthorized amendments, and a formal notification that a state compliance review had been requested. Karen's throat went dry. Evelyn hadn't just written a letter, she'd set a process in motion. It was no longer between the two of them, the state would now be watching. Outside, as the evening light faded across Pinegrove's spotless streets, Karen stood by her window and saw Evelyn tending her garden, calm and unbothered, her terracotta pots glowing in the last golden rays of the sun. 4 years, Karen had ruled this neighborhood with fear. Now, fear belonged to her. The air inside Pinegrove's community hall felt heavier than usual that night. The familiar hum of idle chatter before an HOA meeting was gone, replaced by an uneasy silence that made even the fluorescent lights seem too loud. Karen Wilcox sat at the head of the oak table as she always did, dressed in her signature navy blazer, pearls glinting beneath the harsh ceiling lights. But the confidence that usually radiated from her posture was gone. Her fingers drummed nervously against the gavel. For the first time in 10 years, she wasn't sure how this meeting would end. She'd told herself she could control the narrative, that she could spin Evelyn Brooks' accusations into lies, but the letter from the state compliance office sitting in her folder said otherwise. The residents trickled in one by one, whispering quietly as they took their seats. Karen caught the looks, not the usual respect or fear, but curiosity tinged with something colder. On the far side of the room, Evelyn Brooks entered calmly, carrying a thin folder under her arm. She didn't glance toward Karen. Instead, she greeted a few neighbors, sat in the front row, and folded her hands neatly in her lap. A few of the board members exchanged uneasy looks. Janice, Karen's longtime vice president, wouldn't meet her eyes. Harold, the timid treasurer, looked pale. They all knew something was coming, and no one wanted to go down with the ship. Karen lifted her gavel, clearing her throat. "Let's bring this meeting to order," she said, but her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. She tried to begin with routine announcements, desperate to maintain the illusion of control. But before she could finish, a calm, authoritative voice interrupted from the back of the hall. "Excuse me, Mrs. Wilcox." All heads turned. 2 men in suits, auditors from the State Department of Community Management, stepped forward, accompanied by a uniformed officer from the county sheriff's office. Karen froze. "What is this?" she demanded, though her voice came out thinner than she intended. The older auditor stepped closer, holding up a file. "We're here in response to a compliance review request filed by Mrs. Evelyn Brooks regarding the financial and procedural operations of Pinegrove Estates HOA." The murmur that followed spread through the room like fire through dry grass. Evelyn didn't speak, she simply watched, her expression calm and unreadable. Karen tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "This is absurd," she said quickly. "We're a private organization, you can't just barge in here." The auditor didn't flinch. Under Section 14C of state HOA law, any registered association suspected of misuse of funds or procedural violations is subject to immediate audit. You are, in fact, required to cooperate. He turned toward the crowd. "We've already reviewed preliminary documents." He paused, glancing down at his notes. "And we found discrepancies in meeting minutes, budget allocations, and unauthorized amendments to the HOA charter." A gasp rippled through the residents. Karen's face drained of color. That's impossible," she stammered. "All documents are properly approved by the board." But when she looked at her board members for backup, no one met her eyes. Janice finally spoke, voice trembling. "Karen, we didn't approve those amendments. You just told us they were done." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came. The auditor set a small stack of papers on the table, photocopies of her signatures, lined up neatly beside dates that didn't match any recorded votes. "Forgery, Mrs. Wilcox, is a serious offense," he said quietly. The sheriff stepped forward, resting a hand on his belt, not threatening but firm. "We'll need you to come in for a statement, ma'am." For a long, excruciating moment, the room was completely still. Karen's gavel slipped from her hand, hitting the table with a hollow thud that echoed through the hall. It was over. 10 years of dominance, manipulation, and control, undone by a single letter. When Karen finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "You don't understand. I built this place. I kept it perfect." Evelyn rose slowly from her seat, her calm presence commanding the room without effort. "No," she said softly, "you kept it afraid." Every word landed with quiet precision. "You forgot that a community isn't built by control, but by trust. And trust is something you lost long ago." The room remained silent except for the quiet shuffling of papers as the auditors gathered their files. Karen looked around one last time, at the faces that once smiled out of obligation, now watching her with a mix of relief and disbelief. Her empire had been built on fear, and now that fear was gone, nothing remained to hold it up. As the sheriff gently led her toward the door, Karen turned back to Evelyn, eyes glistening. "You think you've won," she whispered. Evelyn didn't flinch. "I didn't need to win," she said. "The truth did." Outside, the night air was cool and still. The flashing blue lights of the sheriff's cruiser reflected off the manicured lawns of Pinegrove Estates, illuminating the "for sale" signs that had long since gathered dust. Neighbors stood on their porches, watching silently as the Queen of Pinegrove was escorted away, not in handcuffs, but in quiet disgrace. Inside the hall, Evelyn collected her papers, tucking them neatly into her folder. The residents began to murmur again, not in fear this time, but in relief. Some approached her, thanking her in hushed voices. "You saved us," one woman said. Evelyn smiled faintly. "No," she replied, "you just needed someone to remind you what freedom feels like." As she stepped outside into the cool suburban night, the faint sound of crickets filled the air, the kind of peaceful silence Pinegrove hadn't heard in years. The morning after the audit felt like the first real dawn Pinegrove had seen in years. Sunlight washed over the rows of identical houses, soft and golden, as if the neighborhood itself were taking its first deep breath in a decade. For so long, Pinegrove had lived under a kind of gray, not a color of weather, but of fear. People mowed their lawns because they had to, not because they wanted to. They decorated for holidays with hesitation, worried their wreaths or lights might be deemed non-compliant. Now, as the sun rose, something subtle shifted. Curtains opened. Children's laughter drifted down the cul-de-sac. For once, it wasn't followed by Karen's SUV slowing to a stop, clipboard in hand. Her house, the one with the polished hedges and the surveillance cameras, stood quiet and still, its blinds drawn shut. In the following days, the shock of Karen's downfall gave way to something no one expected: unity. Neighbors who had barely spoken in years began to talk again. On a warm Saturday morning, Evelyn found herself standing at the end of her driveway, coffee mug in hand, watching a group of residents gather at the community park. Someone had dragged out a long-forgotten picnic table, its wood faded and splintered. A father was repainting it while two kids handed him brushes. Mrs. Decker from across the street was trimming the rose bushes she used to be fined for having too close to the sidewalk. Harold, the timid treasurer who once signed whatever Karen told him to, was setting up a small speaker and playing soft jazz. The sound floated through the air, unfamiliar yet welcome. For the first time, Pinegrove didn't look perfect. It looked alive. A week later, the community hall filled again, but this time, the atmosphere was completely different. Gone were the stiff chairs arranged in authoritarian rows. Instead, the residents had pushed them into a circle. Evelyn had been asked to help guide the formation of a new HOA board, one that would actually serve the people instead of controlling them. She declined the presidency, preferring instead to stay as an advisor. "You don't need another ruler," she told them with a small smile. "You need a team." The residents nodded, understanding. The new board members were ordinary people: Janice, who'd found the courage to stand up to Karen; Harold, determined to do things right this time; and a young couple who'd recently moved in, full of optimism and ideas. The first motion they passed was simple yet symbolic: to remove the rulebook Karen had built over the years, all 70 pages of unnecessary restrictions, and replace it with 10 clear, fair guidelines about community respect and property care. When Evelyn read the final line aloud, "We are neighbors, not subjects," the room erupted in applause. Karen's name, once spoken with fear, quickly became a cautionary whisper, a story told to newcomers about how power can corrupt even the quietest of streets. Her home went up for sale a month later, her name removed from the HOA charter. The audit results confirmed what everyone suspected: years of misused funds, personal purchases disguised as community upgrades, and self-approved amendments that stripped residents of their voting rights. But justice had done its work quietly and thoroughly. Evelyn never gloated. She never mentioned the letter again. When someone asked her how she knew exactly what to do, she only said, "Experience. And a good memory for the law." She could have taken credit, but she didn't. Her victory wasn't in Karen's downfall, it was in watching Pinegrove stand on its own again. Summer rolled into fall, and the neighborhood blossomed into something unrecognizable. Kids played in the street without being scolded for noise violations. Porch lights stayed on past 10. People started hosting barbecues, inviting one another without fear of fines for unauthorized gatherings. Evelyn's flower pots, the very ones that started it all, now sat proudly on her front steps, overflowing with marigolds and lavender. They'd become a quiet symbol around the neighborhood. Several residents began placing their own colorful pots by their doors as a quiet tribute. One afternoon, as Evelyn tended to her garden, Janice stopped by with a folded flyer in hand. "We're having a neighborhood celebration next weekend," she said with a grin. "The first Pinegrove community picnic, no approval forms required." Evelyn laughed softly and nodded. "I'll bring the lemonade." On the day of the picnic, the park was unrecognizable. Strings of lights hung from tree to tree, children chased bubbles across the grass, and music echoed off the houses that once stood in silence. Harold gave a short, heartfelt speech about renewal and unity, his voice cracking when he mentioned Evelyn. "She reminded us what community means," he said. "Not rules. Not control. Just care." Evelyn, sitting quietly near the back, felt her chest tighten, not with pride, but peace. She looked around and saw faces glowing in the golden afternoon sun, neighbors laughing, dogs running, the air filled with life again. This was what she had wanted all along. Not revenge, but restoration. Pinegrove had learned its lesson, that perfection isn't the same as happiness, and that sometimes it takes one voice, one letter, to bring a neighborhood back to life. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, painting the sky in orange and pink, Evelyn took one last look around. Children were roasting marshmallows, couples were talking, and Janice was dancing barefoot on the grass. From the far end of the park, a breeze carried the faint scent of roses and barbecue smoke, imperfect, uncoordinated, human. Evelyn smiled to herself and whispered, "Welcome back, Pinegrove." She knew this was the real victory, not in the downfall of a tyrant, but in the rebirth of a community that had remembered how to live free. The queen was gone, but the kingdom, at last, belonged to the people again.